Howdy, y'all. Welcome back to another episode of Rednecks Rising, the anti-fascist, anti-racist, anti-capitalist Appalachian podcast, where we amplify all things community organizing, healing, and hell-raising. My name is Chelsea. I have the privilege of being your tour guide on this ride together. For safety reasons, I do have to ask that you please make sure to keep all limbs inside the vehicle at all times and do not remove your seatbelt or your helmet. This is an independently produced podcast, which means all the research, scheduling, recording, and editing, happens by yours truly. And you are going to hear a couple ads throughout this episode, but otherwise, today's episode is brought to us by illegal liquor, abolitionists everywhere, and my local public library. Oh, and not to mention the monthly supporters who keep this show alive and cast their vote in our poll for the content that they wanted to talk about this week. The poll was technically for February content, but you know, NASCAR rose to the top and that's what I was feeling, so why not just get a head start? Today's episode took me longer than they usually do for the research portion. Who knew that there was so much out there on the history of illegal liquor and stock car racing? I would have never guessed. But I guess now you know what we're going to be talking about today. And before we dig into that, we got to practice some good old-fashioned Southern hospitality and make sure that we get our housekeeping in order first. To kick us off with, if you want to be able to participate in polls like the one that helps determine what content we talk about each week, or if you want to be a part of our Discord community, maybe even access other sweet perks, you can do that by becoming a monthly supporter over on our Ko-Fi page at ko-fi.com. That's ko-fi.com/rednecksrising. That's plural, rednecks. That is the alternative to Patreon that we use, as many of you have heard me say before. But in case you're new here or just need a friendly reminder, I will also drop that link in the episode show notes as always. You can also make a one-time contribution on that same page, kind of like throwing a tip our way as a way of showing some appreciation and love for the content if you like what you hear and helping us keep this show going. Remember how I mentioned this is independently produced? Also, I am running way behind on updating my spreadsheets and determining who our support funds are going to go to from November and December. But as soon as I get my head screwed on straight, I promise that is coming. For those who don't know, when folks contribute to the show through our Ko-Fi page, we use that money to cover the costs of production of this show first and foremost, but then we take half of whatever is left over and send it to folks on the ground in Appalachia doing the good work to build up and heal our communities. One last announcement before we dig into some current events for today. I am getting ready to schedule out interviews for recording to include in the upcoming spring content in particular. As some of y'all have heard me say before, I want to use this platform to amplify the voices and stories of Appalachian folks who have been historically and are currently underrepresented, like Appalachians who are Black and Indigenous and Latine or other Appalachians of color, queer Appalachians, trans Appalachians, etc. If that's you or someone you know, please hit me up. I really want to sit down with you. We all want to hear your story. You can always reach out to us on social media or drop us an email at rednecksrising@gmail.com. I always include a link to our link tree in the show notes of each episode so you can find all the ways to support and connect with us in one easy spot. And don't even have to stress about memorizing our email address either. All right, I think that's enough chores for one day, and my ADHD is moving on to something else, so I think we should too. I mentioned back in the first episode of 2023 that I was going to be trying some new things based on the feedback that you shared at the end of the year. We're still a relatively new podcast and we've got plenty of time to learn and grow, and I want to make sure we're all having a good time. In our last episode, I brought on at the last minute Ash from West Virginia, and truly shout out Ash for literally hopping on before flying out of town the very next day. Truly MVP. Ash gave us a rundown of what has been happening in the West Virginia state legislature. Would love to know what y'all thought of that segment in last week's episode. Hit me up. You know where to find me in that link tree, of course. This week, I'm going to try my hand at covering very briefly sort of a rapid fire status of a couple of things happening across the region. But before I do that, I just want to amplify that even though it's not, given the timing that this episode is going to be dropping following the death of Tyree Nichols, even though Memphis is not in Appalachia, it is all of us until it is none of us. And I don't think that there's any words that are necessary for me to offer in this moment, but I do want to offer space to hold the grief and outrage and pain that so many of us are experiencing in the wake of this tragedy. I want to hold that space by just taking a moment of silence before I move on to the rest of the content for today. All right, so for today, as far as West Virginia is concerned, it is not looking any brighter than it was when we heard from Ash. According to their social media page, as of Saturday night, January 28th, the anti-trans House Bill 2007 is on the House Judiciary's agenda for Monday. This is one of the bills that Ash shared with us, and it's one that would ban gender-affirming procedures for folks under 18, procedures which rarely occur. And as Ash explained, it would actually have ramifications far beyond just surgery. If you're hearing this and you live in West Virginia, Ash is encouraging folks to contact Judiciary Chair Moore Capito and ask that he remove this bill from their agenda for Monday morning. That contact information and a script can be found on Ash's Twitter. I will link to that in the show notes for today's episode. In addition to HB 2007, across the board in West Virginia, we're also seeing proposed bills that would prohibit providers who accept CHIP and Medicaid from covering all gender-affirming surgeries for trans youth and young adults under 18. We're seeing bills that would try to block abortion pills from being shipped into West Virginia, bills that would prohibit the direct or symbolic endorsement of abortion, and so much more. Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia are also among the more than 11 states that have now introduced legislation attacking the rights of transgender youth and sometimes adults. And on a totally separate note, but a piece of news that caught me way off guard and I think is interesting and also a really powerful example of the insatiable hunger of capitalism that will forever extract from our people and our places. There's this place super close to where I live called Murphy, North Carolina. It's right on the state line by Tennessee and Georgia. I actually used to work at a brewery there called Valley River Brewing. And anyways, apparently there is a giant cryptocurrency mine that has been placed there. which when I first read this article, I was like, what the actual fuck is a cryptocurrency mine? And what I have come to determine is that it is just a giant warehouse server kind of situation where computer servers and fans and stuff are stacked on top of each other. Truly, capitalism will go to endless lengths in pursuit of profit and power, y'all. So anyways, the news story was about how this facility is so loud because of all of the fans and stuff at all hours of the day that it produces the same amount of sound as a jet engine. And the folks in Murphy are actually considering moving out of the area as a result. Apparently, I actually did not know this until I read this piece of news. Bans on crypto by places like China have led folks who are looking to harvest cryptocurrency. They are searching for locations along Appalachia because this area is an area with relatively affordable power where regulation is usually non-existent. So these cryptocurrency mines, along with winter storms, have been blamed for rolling blackouts in power grids built by the Tennessee Valley Authority, which have rarely happened in the entire history of the program. And the whole time that the blackouts were going on, the mine never shut down. Funny, but not funny haha, funny weird. All right, I know this segment is short for today, but that is enough news. I hate it here. We all do. Let's talk about something more fun, like liquor or fast cars, or both. Where do I even start with this episode, y'all? I feel like every story is just a circle. There's no real end or real beginning, but I'm going to give it a shot. Before I get started, I do want to offer a friendly reminder that I am in no way an expert on this matter, and I am not a historian. So, if I say something that has you pulling out your hair and screaming, "Bestie, what are you talking about?" please holler, let me know so I can correct myself. Now, let's start by talking about moonshine, since it's a whole lot older than automobiles are. Now, folks have been making their own liquor and recreational alcohol for basically as long as humans have been around. And folks have been making their liquor illegally for long before we knew it as moonshine. And just because we're talking about liquor and fast cars today does not mean that we are going to make it out of here without me getting on my soapbox about the rich and powerful doing their best to keep us under the thumb of white supremacist capitalism. Because, as I'm about to share, making illegal liquor isn't just about liquor being illegal. It's about liquor being profitable. So with that in mind, let's start today's journey by looking at the history of liquor as a profitable and taxable substance. Like I said, we've been making alcoholic beverages for basically all of human history. So we'll skip all of the boring parts and jump to 1622 in Ireland, the year that the government imposed a tax on whiskey. You can imagine how well something like that went over in Ireland. Pay taxes on a drink that was made for personal use from grain that was grown on their own land? As if. Meanwhile, in America, the colonies had taken to brewing beer and cider by the 1630s, but it's just not the same. So in the 1700s, when the Scots-Irish settlers showed up, they brought with them their traditions of the hard shit. For folks who don't know, at that point in time in the colonial era and the generations prior, alcohol was like a major component of everyday life. Like they drink so much more than we do. I've heard that it was because sometimes the water was safe to drink and they would get sick if they drank it, so alcohol was considered safer. And during the Revolutionary War at the end of the 1700s, the colonies were cut off from being able to import alcohol or the major ingredients that they used for distilling it, like the molasses that they needed for rum, which was the preferred drink at the time. And so it was then that whiskey became the go-to because it could be made from homegrown barley, rye, and corn. After securing colonial independence, the folks in charge were real concerned about the working members of the colony becoming dependent on alcohol. And so, in 1791, the Excise Act went into effect to impose the first tax on domestically distilled spirits in the United States. Now, I'll let you do the math and tell us. How do you think this might impact folks like, say, the farmers in Western Pennsylvania? Distilling their grain into whiskey, after all, was a practical way for farmers to preserve their crops. One pair of 8-gallon kegs on a single pack horse was a whole lot easier to move across the Allegheny Mountains to markets in the east than heavy sacks of grain, which would need to be carried by an entire team of animals. Typically, those farmers, when they reached the other side of the range, would barter their whiskey for iron and salt without exchanging any cash at all. But the government's new law demanded cash as payment for taxes on that whiskey that was made and traded. And then the new law unfairly charged rural folks a flat fee that cost them disproportionately high taxes for less production than the city and village folks. So how do y'all think that might impact folks? And what do we do in rural Appalachia when the rich and powerful try to do wrong by us? Well, we organize, of course. So, the people of Western Pennsylvania started organizing and drafting petitions to demand a repeal of the tax law. At a meeting in Pittsburgh in 1792, they handed over an outline of their demands, along with a description of their intentions for folks who signed on as government tax collectors. And I quote, "We will consider such persons as unworthy of our friendship, have no intercourse or dealings with them, withdraw from them every assistance, withhold all the comforts of life which depend upon those duties that as a man and fellow citizens we owe to each other, and upon all occasions treat them with the contempt they deserve." Ooh, this is what I mean when I say we are not passive aggressive. Here in Appalachia, we are just aggressive. And we don't fuck with the law around these parts, so ultimately, many refused to pay the tax and followed through on their pledge to make life difficult and dangerous for the tax collectors. We're talking collectors being assaulted in their homes, tied up, threatened with hanging, and being tarred and feathered, left outside in the woods overnight and otherwise terrorized until they publicly resigned from the tax collector position. The violence got so intense that a lot of folks from Western Pennsylvania started moving to Kentucky, actually, and eventually President George Washington himself had to get involved. Washington issued a statement in August of 1794 letting the resistance know that the federal government was prepared to forcefully quash their efforts. After negotiations between the anti-tax resistance and the federal government led to a dead end, federal troops were officially called in to contain the situation. At 2 a.m. on a night which would later become known as Dreadful Night, soldiers raided homes and pulled men from their beds, threatening them with hanging as their families looked on helplessly. Around 200 men were made to march half-dressed and without shoes through cold, muddy streets. They were tied back to back to spend the night in barns, stables, and cellars. 20 men were treated with particular cruelty and were forced to walk for 30 days to Philadelphia, where on Christmas Day they were paraded through the city streets to the city jail, hungry and weak, before a crowd of 20,000 onlookers. Each of the 20 men wore a hat that had a piece of paper attached to it with the word insurgent written on it. After 200 men had been marched through the streets by the federal government for resisting the tax, only 12 cases went to trial and 2 men were convicted for treason. And still, after he wrapped up his 2 terms as president, George Washington retired to his farm in Virginia in 1797, where he became a distiller himself, and a very profitable one at that. Cough, cough. So that brings us to the 1800s in this journey of alcohol and this corporation, country. So in 1802, Thomas Jefferson repealed the whiskey tax while he was president, and for most of the 1800s, the government left distillers alone. Well, white distillers anyways. Part of the history of moonshine making is that it is also evolved as part of a resistance to discriminatory practices instituted by white authorities. For example, the Lumbee and Tuscarora peoples made liquor illegally long before white moonshiners, as the North Carolina General Assembly had banned, quote, free people of color, end quote, from making and selling liquor in 1825 and again in 1840. That said, the government mostly left white distillers alone, except for when it came to war. There was a brief snafu during the War of 1812 when the feds imposed a tax on alcohol to fund their adventure. And in the second half of the century, the United States was confronted with the Civil War and once again turned to taxation as a means of getting the cash that they needed. In 1861, Abe Lincoln created the nation's first federal income tax. And it didn't just tax income, though. It called for a sales tax on certain items and a flat tax on certain services as well. It went into effect in 1862, and by 1864, the tax on liquor had been raised from 20 cents to 60 cents and then to $1.50 per gallon. After the end of the war, the tax on whiskey and other liquors kept climbing as high as $2 per gallon, from 20 cents to $2. Folks said, fuck that, fuck you, and turned to underground distilling operations. And can anyone blame them? So the government brings on a bunch of revenue agents intended to enforce the tax law. Remember how we've talked about how this whole fucking criminal justice system is meant to punish folks for deviating from the demands and expectations of white supremacist capitalism? Sierra Kennedy and I talk about that in the episode with her early on in the podcast. So here we go. Anyways, revenue agents to enforce the tax law. Tax police. Raids conducted by these agents would often turn violent, which, makes total sense considering what we see today from police, right? But I just want to give y'all an example because it wasn't always violence from the police. In 1867, 12 of these revenue agents targeted one neighborhood known as Port Richmond, located along the Delaware River. It was an Irish neighborhood. The folks who lived there tended to be families of Irish laborers who worked at the port unloading black coal brought to the city from the mines in the northeastern region of the state. So these agents come into Port Richmond and they're able to disrupt some local distillers and confiscate their stills and some other equipment, but as they made their way down a nearby street, the officers are swarmed by an angry mob of between 200 and 300 men women, and children who shouted insults and threats and threw stones at them. One man beat an agent with the club. The agent is shooting back at the man with his revolver. And all the while this fight is happening, two women broke through the crowd and stole back one of the stills from the agents. So the agents were forced to retreat with 6 of their men wounded and leave behind what they had come all that way for in the first place. Also, I wish I knew the name of those women. Eventually, the pushback against the taxes pushed the feds to lower them from $2 to 50 cents per gallon in 1868, but the ball had already been set in motion, and underground business wasn't about to quit anytime soon. In fact, the following years, illegal distilling reached epidemic proportions in the South. In an 1877 report, the Internal Revenue Commissioner raised the alarm over the activity that their agents were seeing in Georgia, Kentucky, North Carolina, Tennessee, and West Virginia, describing no less than 3,000 stills being operated across that area. He wrote, "They are usually located at inaccessible points in the mountains, away from ordinary lines of travel, and are generally owned by unlettered men of desperate character, armed and ready to resist officers of the law." Yeehaw! Considering this tax was imposed to fund the Civil War, which many moonshiners didn't want any part of to start with, they were especially unhappy about it. And a lot of folks saw the tax as an unfair burden on the poor folks of the region. Why should struggling farmers be prevented from turning their grain into whiskey for more profit? It was just a means of survival for mountain folk, a time-honored traditional way to support a family. Remember, what do we do in rural Appalachia when the rich and powerful try to do wrong by us? We organize. Just like the Pennsylvania whiskey rebels before them, moonshiners in the southern mountains fought back against the tax collectors, banding together to defend their territory from the overreach of the law. They continued to make their whiskey on the black market, refusing to pay taxes. Revenue agents would hunt for secret distilling operations. They would go undercover as hunters and fishermen if they had to. In 1877, 11 officers made their way to Overton County in Tennessee, where they stopped for the night after having traveled for 3 days by foot following the trail of local moonshiners. That night, armed men circled the property. They fired on the agents as more anti-tax resistors joined in until their numbers swelled to 200. The officers took shelter and the siege continued for 42 hours. And it wasn't about the alcohol. It was about survival under capitalism, right? In the aftermath of the Civil War, farmers faced desperate economic conditions. They had every reason possible to keep right on making liquor without paying taxes. As a reporter for Southern Home said in 1878, if the revenue law is strictly enforced against the poor and ignorant class, okay, well, that was rude, but all right, carry on, who carry on this trade in our mountains, it virtually deprives them of making the article for sale because the license tax is so high that they cannot pay it and clear any profits. I don't know that I would have phrased this quote the same way either, from Horace Keppert in his 1913 book, Our Southern Highlanders, but I do agree with the general sentiment that he shares when he says that, quote, "Folks don't make whiskey in secret at the peril of imprisonment or death because they are outlaws by nature, nor from any other kind of depravity, but simply and solely because it looks like easy money to poor folks." Or, as Millard Ashley, a moonshiner out of Wilkes County, North Carolina, says, "That'll put you in the liquor business. You walking around with no money in your pocket." Between the taxes and the black market and the uprisings of resistance, over the course of a century, making whiskey went from being a respectable subject of lectures and essays aimed at boosting American agriculture and entrepreneurship to an underground endeavor, fueled by poverty and marked by stigma. You know how in previous episodes I've talked about how white nationalist groups and organized groups of fascists capitalize on the economic desperation of poor white folks to prey on their trauma and further instill division between poor white folks and poor black folks, poor indigenous folks, or other poor folks of color? Well, that playbook was written forever ago, and we know that. They did the exact same thing back then. The Ku Klux Klan would connect with moonshiners and pitch themselves as protection from the big bad government and their war-hungry money hoarding. An 1871 tax collector in Western North Carolina, right where I'm from, wrote that illegal liquor makers in Polk, Yancey, Jackson, Cleveland, Rutherford, Transylvania, Clay, and Ashe counties were under a kind of protection of that secret organization called the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan would intimidate and attack officers and their informants on behalf of the moonshiners. As the century came to a close and the shift in cultural perception really started to set in, the sympathetic public notions of the poor man trying to feed his family or the heroic defender of the right to privacy solidly changed, particularly among middle-class North Carolinians in towns and cities. Press started to characterize moonshiners as ignorant, violent, sexually menacing beasts, or even, as Harper's Weekly called them in an 1879 article, big-boned, semi-barbarian people. Reporters would even claim that moonshiners had a distinctly foul odor, depict them as morally depraved, sexually promiscuous. It's almost like the rich and powerful keep recycling the same narrative against all of the groups that they want to suppress, oppress, and keep divided. Really suspicious, huh? I don't know how many of y'all have listened to the first episode of the podcast lately, What is a Redneck? But just like they did with the word redneck, politicians also capitalized on this shifting narrative. North Carolina, for example, was effectively transformed into a one-party state dominated by the Democrats at the turn of the century. The Dems were able to dominate the election by tying together the causes of race and alcohol. For example, they often employed the trope of the drunk black man in their campaign to deny black folks their political rights while also expanding white supremacy. In fact, prohibitionists were natural allies to the Democrats' disenfranchisement campaign, as most believed that the black folks' vote was the greatest barrier to prohibition. They even hailed the passage of the state constitutional amendment in 1901 that effectively prevented all black folks from voting in North Carolina. Weird how race and class are always interconnected when we really start to examine these things, and always for the purpose of maintaining wealth and power for the ruling class. Barf. Add to all that political manipulation that was happening the economic changes that were also taking place. The fact that rural agricultural areas in the region were feeling the industrial era's takeover and transforming into mill towns, areas dominated by furniture factories or tobacco manufacturing plants. Well, of course, mill and factory owners wanted their employees to be sober. They needed to be reliable, industrious, pay a little, but need them to work a lot. And then also add in the fact that there was a social temperance movement that was starting to grow around the same time, and suddenly all the economic, social, and political changes at the turn of the century were bringing new and influential allies to the cause of prohibition. The overall recipe was not looking good for the legal alcohol industry. As an aside, I did not know what the temperance movement was when I started this episode, so in case you were like me and had undiagnosed ADHD in public school, the quick explanation is that it's like the movement that's pretty typically backed by religion that promotes the moderation of and or abstinence from alcohol. I also want to mention that while a lot of middle-class women flocked to the temperance movement and the cause of prohibition, poor women in large numbers had at least some involvement in the illegal liquor business as one state after another went dry, passing legislation against alcohol sales and consumption. Georgia, Oklahoma, Mississippi, North Carolina, Tennessee, West Virginia, Alabama, Virginia. Something in my gut tells me that all the white women who are supportive of bootlicking causes today, in this day and age, also aren't the poor white women either. But what do I know? In response to the massive demand for illegal liquor following Prohibition, the first decades of the 1900s were huge in the history of moonshine. Although this little tidbit isn't from Appalachia, I thought it was a pretty awesome little story worth sharing. There were some creative Wake County moonshiners who organized a, quote, communistic, profit-sharing, socialistic defiance of iniquitous taxes in 1905. So they sold stock in their moonshine enterprise throughout their township, and there still reportedly had 12 to 14 owners who were all prosperous and self-respecting citizens. In 1910, automobiles were invented and would become a game changer for transporting illegal liquor, although they wouldn't be accessible for poor and working folks for a bit of time still. One of the first arrests related to hauling liquor in an automobile in North Carolina happened in 1917, right over the county line from me in Henderson County. The sheriff pulled over a car containing 4 well-known business and society men of Asheville. When searching the car, the sheriff found a 10-gallon keg and a 1-gallon demijohn containing moonshine. Moonshiners came up with all kinds of creative tactics to keep folks away from their stills who might be snooping on purpose or stumble there on accident, like hunters, hikers, curious wanderers, and the like. They spread rumors about ghosts, evil swamp creatures, boojums, wampus cats, bears, mountain lions, and wolves. And then there was more war. The government used World War I and the conditions surrounding the war to crack down on moonshine traffic, rationing the ingredients necessary for distillation. They would even arrest storekeepers like Arvil Pruitt out of Wilkes County for selling too much sugar or other ingredients necessary for the distillation process. In the late 1920s and 1930s, when the Great Depression hit, in rural areas, particularly in the sharecropping regions in the Appalachian Mountains, folks were desperate for money and ready to take risks associated with making, transporting, and selling moonshine. At the same time, the Model Ford T and other cheap cars became accessible to working folks as they found their way to used markets and junkyards. Cars were a big deal. Not just a symbol, but a literal connection to independence, freedom, opportunity. By and large, the moonshine industry became almost totally dependent on the automobile during the 1920s and 1930s. Now here is where we start to set the stage for the connection between moonshine and NASCAR. But to help us set the stage a little bit, I think we need at least some social context on the role of sports and its interaction and culture at this point, since we've spent all of this time providing this historical context and role of alcohol and moonshine in culture and time and place. One of the books I read talked about how prior to NASCAR, recreational activities and sports in rural southern areas in particular were known for being active, action-oriented, exciting, potentially dangerous or violent, sports like hunting and fighting. And I found it interesting and also pretty spot on that the book observed how sports in the South were performed as rituals of manhood as defined by the patriarchy, both in participation and spectating. It was like a demonstration of aggression, virility, dominance, and how these notions of male identity were especially important to poor white folks who didn't have the option of competing economically. This constant need to fight for survival, to prove that we're worth it, and this system of white supremacist capitalism that's constantly telling us we aren't worth anything. So here we are in the 1930s-ish, a time when few children of mill families and farm families and working class families completed high school. Usually they didn't feel like they belonged among the other students in the high schools at the time, and so the rituals of manhood evolved to include driving and racing stock cars on highways and fairgrounds. Success in street racing could turn a young man with very little social standing, minimum athletic ability, some mechanical skills, and good hand-eye coordination, along with a healthy dose of audacity, into a local legend. Lee Petty, a name some of y'all may be familiar with, who became a 3-time champion in NASCAR's top division, took that exact path to become a local legend in Randolph County, North Carolina. Street racing competitions among bootleggers became especially intense. Experience outrunning the law and racing friends on the local roads had primed moonshiners and their trippers for success in more organized forms of auto racing. And there had actually existed a professional racing establishment in larger cities and in the Northeast, but it was really largely intended for more elite audiences. Similarly, in the early 1900s, there had been auto racing in the South, such as the races in Ormond Beach that centered around the massive Hotel Ormond, which was an elite resort. And not only did it cater to the richer class of folks, but it was also a sport that did not survive the Great Depression in this part of the country. By the 1930s, the production of illegal alcohol was completely enmeshed in the economy and life of southern Appalachian areas, including Wilkes County, North Carolina, where there's plenty of remote mountain hollers, but where it's still located on the edge of the Piedmont, giving moonshiners easy access to customers in nearby mill towns and the expanding urban areas. Moonshiners would modify their cars with parts and equipment to boost their power, carry more liquor, and avoid the law as Thunder Road car chases became more and more common. On top of having a good car, outrunning the law required a lot of audacity and driving skill. Drivers would have to use all kinds of moves to evade the law. They developed the power slide, which is the method of maintaining speed during turns on dirt roads by causing the rear wheels to slide while turning the front wheels opposite and accelerating through. The bootleg turn also became another favorite. Driving at full speed, a moonshiner would either throw the gear in a second, making a sharp turn and letting the car swing around itself, or put the car into a skid, pulling on the emergency brake just lightly, turning the steering wheel sharply to the left, and then accelerating like hell. When executed properly, when pulling the bootleg turn, the driver would do a 180 and head in the opposite direction. When not executed properly, it could easily land the car on the roof, and everyone and everything inside the car would end up in the hands of the law. Hence the need for audacity. The skills that the drivers gained in handling their cars at high speeds on dirt roads translated very well into racing on dirt racetracks. For a lot of moonshiners, they were already interested in fast cars, and they were generally competitive, so racing each other and finding out who had the fastest car and who could handle it the best was a natural inclination. Picture drag races, but old school, starting out in cow pastures and streets and highways and making their way to horse tracks. Cars lined up side by side, somebody waving an oily rag. These late night races would attract hundreds of people and thousands of dollars in side bets. This activity took on a special meaning in a region that offered very few entertainment options for young folks in the working class. And then there was more war. Honestly, war is like the landmark of how we measure our time throughout history in this country. So we got to have a new one every few years. That really just says a lot about us, doesn't it? So when World War II happened, it changed a lot about stock racing and moonshine. On the one hand, the experiences of combat produced a generation of men recovering from trauma and seeking adrenaline as a source of coping, along with a new generation of mechanics. On the other hand, draft boards disqualified many bootleggers from the draft due to their criminal records, and there were lots of thirsty defense workers and enlisted men who wanted whiskey but couldn't afford legal liquor. The skyrocketing tax on whiskey hit $9 by 1944, and conditions were ripe for boosting illegal liquor production. Roy Hall is a name I had never heard of before this episode, but some of you may have heard of before. And this is a fella who was born to a poor family in Dawsonville, Georgia in the 1920s. After dropping out of school at 10 years old and moving to live with his uncle, he got involved with his cousin in running moonshine, among other illegal activity. Roy eventually had gone on to race in stock races in the Atlanta area, even in Daytona, until the racing industry had died off in the area. And during World War I, Roy Hall and others organized a series of bootlegger sweepstakes, high-stakes races held in the dead of night over Atlanta area highways that drew hundreds of spectators. Organizers offered cash prizes, and participants and spectators placed heavy side bets on the outcomes. In response to the concern of political and religious leaders in the area over the decline in morality and public order, it was announced that Lakewood Speedway would host a stock car race along with the National Hillbilly Jamboree and free fireworks on Labor Day. The entry list of popular local drivers grew quickly, and it included folks with lengthy police records for traffic and liquor law violations, folks like Roy Hall himself. Working class folks were thrilled that they could pack the stands and cheer for their favorite liquor haulers, but the rich and powerful, mostly in the form of press articles and behind-the-scenes pressure, pushed against allowing the kind of low-life criminals such as liquor haulers enter the race. They went so far as to show up on the day of the race with police forces and try to enforce disqualification of the drivers. They eventually conceded to the demands of the crowd, which was about 30,000 strong. And after all that, Roy Hall won the first stock car race in the area after the war. And the following year, Lakewood Speedway issued a bootlegger ban preventing bootleggers from racing in future races. But other fairground tracks started offering stock car racing. And then the war surplus of heavy earth-moving equipment in the post-war era made it possible for just about anybody to make a little dirt racetrack. So a trio of bootleggers from Wilkes County heard about a race in South Carolina and decided to make their way down south. After the race, they sought out the man behind the magic, Bill France, and talked to him about the possibility of building a track near their home. Over the course of the next 6 months, they began one of the most successful build it and they will come projects in sports history. The two principals in the operation had deep, strong connections to Wilkes County's moonshine industry. The North Wilkesboro track was an immediate and huge success. In a county with roughly 40,000 residents, in a town of only 3,500 that was 60 miles from the closest reasonably sized city, events at the track still brought in an estimated 70,000 fans. The success of stock car racing and the North Wilkesboro track in particular drew the attention of others with ties to illegal alcohol, leaving behind solid evidence of the involvement in bootleggers in the construction and management of at least 6 major NASCAR tracks. As different race organizers began to show up and organize events at the racetracks that were being constructed across the region, dozens of sanctioning bodies across the nation were declaring champions and competing for attention from racers and fans. In 1947, Bill France called a meeting for folks who cared about stock car racing in the area. At the meeting, Bill argued that the best way to advance the sport of stock car racing was to create an overarching body made up of an organized group of race car drivers that would standardize the rules and purses and create a true national champion. He also called for a benevolence fund and insurance for drivers and mechanics, which wasn't something that they typically had at the time. He talked openly about the core group of potential fans and drivers most attracted to stock car racing, the working class. He suggested that there was a strong potential for Sunday shows because of the likelihood that fans wouldn't be working on Sundays and that it would allow working class racers who worked on weekdays to compete in the races. At that meeting called by Bill France, the group decided to settle on a name for their organization, the National Association for Stock Car Auto Racing. And on February 21st, 1948, NASCAR was founded. I do think that might be a good place for us to wrap up for today. I am going to have to come back for another entire episode on the evolution of NASCAR and where it has come since 1948. But for now, I think I gotta call it a night. What a wild ride, y'all. Truly, I didn't think this episode was going to be like this, but y'all always be keeping me on my toes. And before we do any kind of follow-up on NASCAR, the next episode will be dropping in the upcoming days, featuring an interview with one of my favorite humans in the entire world, Desiree B. Stevens. She's an anti-racist coach and educator who's doing fabulous work on the internet and in the real world. I had so much fun talking to Desiree, and as always, she blew my mind. So I know y'all won't want to miss that one. I'm really excited to share it with you. And in the meantime, please support the show by hitting the subscribe button wherever you're currently listening to this and by following us on all your favorite social platforms, which you can find in the link tree located in the show notes for today's episode, along with the resources that I used when researching today's episode. Please don't be like that one guy on TikTok who said that the episode he was listening to on the Race and Labor rabbit hole was good, but that I was making claims that weren't backed by evidence, even though there were 10 literal articles cited in the show notes. Please don't be like that person. I love you. I don't want to feel that way about you. Also, don't forget to reach out if you or someone you know wants to sit down with us on the podcast to share your story and your work as a hell-raising hillbilly. With all that said, thank y'all so much for being a part of this fierce and beautiful community and making this show possible. Lord willing and the creek don't rise, we'll talk to you again soon.